Good evening. I am your creepy counselor, and you have found yourself here in the Vale. Before I approve your visa to travel to the other side, I have something you will need. The creepy counselor reaches into his pocket and pulls out an old-looking watch and hands it to you. Do not lose this watch. You will need this. But before you go, please remember my advice. If you ever feel uneasy, or if they notice you at any point, run, and I will open the veil for you again. I've always been drawn to the darker corners of the internet. Not the dark web, just obscure websites and blogs with next to no users. That's how I stumbled upon the 13th floor ritual. It was just a post on an obscure forum, but it promised an experience beyond anything imaginable, a glimpse into a world that defied explanation, with the promise of good fortune for those who followed the ritual steps correctly. I've archived the post, and while I won't link it here this time, it reads as follows. Greetings. Below you will find instructions on how to perform the 13th floor ritual. They say if you perform the ritual correctly, you'll have good fortune, but at a cost. Some claim they've seen the other side, while others have vanished without a trace. So who's brave enough to try? 1. Find a building with at least 13 floors. It must have an elevator that can access all floors without restrictions. 2. Begin the ritual at 1 in the morning. This is 1 hour past midnight, also known as the true 13th hour. 3. Enter the elevator alone. If anyone else gets on, you must wait and start over. 4. Press the buttons in ascending order, starting with 1 all the way through 13, stopping on each floor. You must not proceed if the elevator stops on any floor where you did not press a button. 5. When you reach the 13th floor, the doors will open to a hallway that doesn't exist in our realm. You may see figures in the distance. Do not, for any reason, interact with them or show fear. 6. Leave an object of personal significance in the hallway. The greater the significance, the greater the fortune. This is your offering. 7. Return to the elevator and do not, for any reason, turn around. Press the button for the first floor. If the elevator begins ascending instead, immediately press any other floor's button to disrupt the ascent. 8. Exit the building immediately after reaching the first floor. Do not look back. Do not go back. Ever. If you've made it past the final step, congratulations. You may now begin to experience good fortune. You can thank me later. Regards, M. After reading this, I called up my buddy, who I will refer to as Steve in this story for the sake of anonymity. Steve and I go way back, and both of us have enjoyed trying outlandish internet ceremonies in order to document the results. It's a sort of hobby we have shared since middle school. Everything we had ever done before this had, unsurprisingly, ended in disappointing results, which is why it was no surprise when Steve initially declined my invitation to join me on this particular excursion. Nah, man, I don't think so. I mean, thanks for the offer, but Kristen's mom's visiting from Vermont this weekend, and she needs me to help move some furniture to get her apartment ready, he told me. Plus, the post you sent says that only one person is allowed to perform the ritual, and it's not like anything ever happens anyway. Of course nothing happens, I chuckled in reply. But the fun is in the experience. Come on, man, there's no way I'm going into an old building at night by myself. You can just use the stairs to meet me at each floor. I don't know, man. That furniture... Nobody moves furniture at night, Steve. You just don't want Kirsten's mom to find out about your little hobby. Isn't that it? Maybe, Steve sighed. I could hear the hesitation in his voice. I knew I had him. Come on, Steve. We'll both be going off to college in the fall. We gotta at least have one last adventure before then. Man, Kristen really has turned you into a scaredy cat. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Steve relented. All right, fine. But if we get caught, I'm telling the police you were holding me hostage. Deal, I said with a grin. I'll pick you up at 11 tonight. We set out to find a building tall enough, old enough, and most importantly, abandoned enough to perform the ritual. It took longer than we expected, and it was already 12:40 when we settled on what building to use. After a bit of back and forth between me and Steve, we decided on the Markham building. It was an old, worn-out 18-floor structure originally built in the 1930s when Art Deco architecture was still a thing. It's mostly unused nowadays, save for the first floor, which I believe operates as an insurance office during the morning hours. Though, don't quote me on that. The rest of the building hasn't been leased out since the 90s. We parked a few blocks away from the Markham building to avoid drawing any unwanted attention. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sounds being the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As we approached the building, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The Markham building loomed over us. I imagine it must have been one of the tallest, grandest buildings in the area during its time. But it was now marred by years of neglect and decay. Steve and I had anticipated that entering the building might pose a bit of a challenge, as the first floor was at least still in partial use. But this hadn't stopped us from getting into other similar locations in the past, though this would be the biggest building we'd ever forced our way into. We could see through the glass doors at the entrance that the first floor was still illuminated, as if someone might still be inside. I pushed gently on the door, and to our surprise, it gave easily, swinging open with no effort at all. Steve and I glanced at each other, in a mixture of surprise, excitement, and nervousness. Steve quickly put his lock-picking tools back into his front pocket. We had been kind of worried about being seen by any cameras inside, but now that the door hadn't been locked, we were no longer very concerned with being charged with unlawful entry, as for all we knew, the building was still open. In fact, we were now more concerned about running into an employee who might question us and what we were up to. Cautiously, we made our way through the entrance, past the empty receptionist desk, and into the main lobby. It was not fancy. In fact, it was rather dingy, and also appeared not to have seen any improvements made to it since the mid-80s when the building had last been renovated. What stood out in contrast to this, however, was the large, shiny, new silver elevator, located on the far side of the room. Half expecting someone to come up from behind, we hastily made our way over to the elevator's metallic doors. "Why is it so new?" asked Steve, holding the flashlight I'd given him, though it was currently pointless. "I don't know," I shrugged. "I guess Wikipedia was wrong, and this place has been renovated pretty recently. Heck, maybe even the other floors aren't abandoned either." Steve didn't reply, but the uneasiness on his face was very easy for me to read. The instructions were clear. At 1 hour past midnight, I was to enter the elevator alone, visit floors in a specific order, and never, under any circumstances, look back once the elevator reached the 13th floor. "Remember, you have to take the stairs and meet me on each floor," I reminded Steve. Yeah, I got it," he replied, rolling his eyes. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the first floor. As the doors closed, I could hear the faint sound of Steve's footsteps as he made his way to the stairwell. The elevator began its ascent, and as it did so, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I found myself glancing nervously at the mirror, half expecting to see a shadowy figure lurking behind me. But of course, there was nothing. Just my own rather pale reflection staring back at me. When the doors finally opened on the first floor, I was relieved to see Steve waiting for me. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "Yeah, just feeling a bit creeped out in there," I admitted. "Let's keep going." I pressed the button for the second floor. The doors closed and the elevator continued its journey. We repeated this process, following the sequence of buttons outlined in the ritual. Each time the elevator stopped, I was greeted by Steve. He was always able to get to the next floor ahead of me, as the elevator took around an extra 20 seconds extra in the process of opening and closing its doors. I was also careful to never step out or for him to step in. I didn't want to do anything that could potentially force us to start over. We continued, floor by floor, until I reached the 12th floor. As the doors opened, I fully expected Steve to already be there waiting for me, as he had been on all the other floors. But there was nobody there, just a dark, abandoned office hallway. I didn't want to admit it to myself at the time, but I was scared. "Steve?" I called out softly, and as I did so, that feeling of being watched intensified. I could hear my heart beating loudly in my ears, and for a moment, that prevented me from hearing something else. Eventually, I breathed a sigh of relief when I realized that I could hear Steve's footsteps echoing in the stairwell. He must have already started heading up to the 13th floor. I took a deep breath and pressed the button for the 13th floor. The elevator doors closed with a soft thud, and despite knowing deep down that this ritual was just a prank post by some internet goof, I felt a shiver run down my spine. To me, the ascent felt slower this time, like the elevator itself was reluctant to reach its destination. When the doors finally opened, I was greeted by pitch blackness. The other floors had been dark, sure, but even then there had been still some light coming through the large glass windows that lined some of the walls. My heart was beating quickly as I flicked on my flashlight to see what was ahead of me. Even though I was scared, part of me felt disappointed when all I saw was a hallway that looked completely normal for an abandoned building. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the floor was covered in a worn-out carpet. There were many desk chairs stacked on top of one another in a corner, and a trash bin that appeared to be filled with paper, but otherwise, there was little else to be seen in the hallway. It was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the faint hum of the elevator behind me. I stepped out of the elevator, my heart resuming a more slowed and steady beat. I glanced around, expecting to see Steve waiting for me, but the hallway was empty. I took a few cautious steps forward, my eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. The air felt heavy, and there was still that lingering, unshakable feeling that something was there, watching me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my grandfather's old watch. It had been given to me as a birthday gift from him 3 days before he was killed in a car accident. I had brought it with me as my offering, hoping that its significance to me would be enough to satisfy whatever forces were behind the granting of good luck that the forum poster had alluded to. I placed the watch on the floor beside the trash bin. I'd come back to get it next weekend, I told myself. As I turned back to head back to the elevator, I froze dead in my tracks. It was gone. The elevator was gone. I know this sounds insane, and believe me, that's exactly how I felt in that moment. But the elevator was gone. In its place was a blank wall, as if the elevator had never existed. Panic surged through me, and I spun around searching for any sign of an exit. The hallway stretched out before me, seemingly endless and devoid of any exits or windows. "Steve?" I called out, my voice echoing down the empty hallway. There was no response. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Steve!" I shouted louder this time. Still no response. I hesitated, trying to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I needed to think logically to come up with a plan. If the elevator was gone, then my only option was to find another way out. And that meant exploring the rest of the 13th floor. I hated the idea of that, but what else could I do? I continued down the hallway. My flashlight was quite literally the only source of light. The air grew colder with each step, and the silence was, for lack of a better word, oppressive, as if it were trying to smother me. I called out for Steve again, but there was no reply, just the echo of my own voice bouncing off the walls. I felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that I was not alone. As I ventured further, the hallway began to change. The faded wallpaper peeled away to reveal old, cracked plaster. The carpet disintegrated under my feet, leaving a trail of dust and debris. The chairs that had formerly been stacked neatly were now strewn all across the floor. And then I saw them, the figures. They were distant at first, pretty much just shadows at the edge of my flashlight's reach. But as I moved closer, they became clearer. They were tall, impossibly thin, and completely still. I remembered the warning from the post. Do not interact with them or show fear. But how could I not be afraid? They were like nothing I had ever seen, and their presence filled me with an instinctual terror. I have never felt that level of intense dread before in my life. I don't even know how to accurately describe it. Suddenly, I heard a cry. It was desperate and pleading, and the voice was all too familiar. "Help me!" It was Steve's voice, coming from somewhere ahead. Without thinking, I started running towards the figures and the sound of Steve's voice. I knew I was breaking the rules of the ritual, but I didn't care. Steve was my friend, and he needed me. As I approached the figures, they turned to face me. Their eye sockets seemed to be empty voids, and their toothless mouths were wide open, almost as if they were screaming, but they made no sound at all. I reached out to them, begging for help. I don't know why I did that. It seems so stupid now, but I was desperate, and probably in some sort of state of shock, to be honest. They did not respond. They simply stood there watching me, as Steve's cries grew fainter and fainter, until they were gone entirely. Then I was alone again, surrounded by the figures. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my side, and I realized I had injured myself somehow. It felt like I had hurt myself falling, but I didn't know that I had done that. I sank to the ground in agony for a moment as the figures watched me silently. I could feel my heartbeat pulsing in my head, but I was somehow able to muster the strength to struggle to my feet, despite the pain searing through me. I had to get back to the elevator. I had to escape this nightmare. I stumbled back the way I had come. The figures did not interfere with me. In fact, they seemingly parted to let me pass. When I reached the spot where the elevator should have been, to my amazement, it was there, as if it had never left. I didn't hesitate. I pressed the button for the first floor and collapsed inside as the doors closed, slumping against the wall, my energy spent. That's when I felt the elevator begin to ascend. Panic gripped me once again. This wasn't right. The building only had 18 floors, yet it was already past floor 30 and was still climbing and accelerating. I struggled to sit up and reach for the keypad. My vision blurred, my fingers fumbled, but I managed to press another button. I think it was floor 1, but I could barely see, so I'm not even sure. The lift jolted and then began its descent. When the elevator finally stopped, I braced myself for what I might find. But when the doors opened, I saw I was on the first floor, with everything as it had been before, except now the lights were off. Gasping for air, I crawled out of the elevator, my body screaming in protest. I had to get outside, to find help, but I was so weak and tired that I didn't think I could make it. I couldn't push open the glass door to escape, and then, by some miracle, a car drove by and saw me. A stranger rushed to my side, their voice echoing distantly as they called for help. I awoke the next morning in the hospital. The sunlight beaming into the sterile white room was a welcome sight after the darkness of the Markham building. I sat up, feeling a sharp pain in my side. I glanced around the room, wondering what had happened. The events of last night felt so distant that I began to believe they must have all been a feverish dream. Perhaps I had gotten into a car accident. Just as I had started to convince myself of this narrative, I noticed it. My grandfather's watch, sitting on the table beside my bed, its hands frozen at 1, the true 13th hour. I felt the pit of my stomach drop. Was it really all real? How did the watch get there? What had happened to Steve? I had to find out. Desperate for answers, I returned to the forum where I had originally found the ritual. I posted about my experiences, hoping someone could help me. The responses, what few there were a mix of skepticism and concern, but one message stood out. It was from a user named M, the same person who had posted the ritual. "Congratulations," the message read. "You've seen the other side, but remember, good fortune comes at a cost. The figures you saw are now aware of you, and they will not rest until they have what they want. Be careful, and whatever you do not perform the ritual again." I realized then, with a sinking feeling, that Steve must have been the object of importance that I left on the 13th floor. I had meant to leave my grandfather's watch, but somehow I had accidentally left Steve instead. So that's where I'm at right now. I don't expect any of you to believe me, obviously. Heck, I don't even know if I completely believe it myself. I've tried calling Steve hundreds of times now, to no avail. Kristen, Steve's girlfriend, keeps texting me asking where he is. I don't know how to break the story to her. I do know, though, that I have to go back to that building. I have to perform the ritual again. I can't leave Steve there. I got him into this mess, and I have to be the one to get him out. The doctors say that I have to stay here overnight at the very least, but I can't wait that long. I'm just waiting for 11 o'clock tonight, when I can sneak out of here with just enough time to get back to the Markham building by 1. I know this is just a forum to post stories that are preventing you from getting any sleep, but if you have any genuine advice on what to do or how to get help, please let me know as soon as you can. I only have 13 hours left before I have to go.